Um, okay, here we go. So, welcome to our positivity bias class. We're up to chapter 17, and we're talking about the title of the chapter is called channeling. And again, it comes back to this ongoing theme of how do we make things positive? How do we see things positive? How do we trach good, sein good, think good things, and we'll reveal the good within it. And it's that constant figuring, how to think that way. And one of the primary topics we'll be talking about tonight is this concept of taking our human frailties, like self-centeredness and ego-centric and our own stubbornness, bitterness, these kind of things. How do we take these personal things and turn them into a positive? And so that's going to be the focus here. So I want to start off with a story from the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is about a couple hundred years ago. And during so just putting the Rebbe on a time frame, he was during the time of Napoleon, and in fact they crossed paths. So kind of that gets you the time frame that we're looking at, right? So the Alter Rebbe, Hasidim would come and join the Alter Rebbe for a few weeks or a month at a time, but they had to do this on a schedule. If you started coming in the month of Elul, right before the high holidays, then every year that's your time slot. That's when you come. You couldn't, make your own changes and stuff. Everything had to be with a seder, an organized schedule, and it wasn't changeable, right? And anyone who came to spend time with Alter Rebbe and learn Hasidus from the Alter Rebbe, then on his way home, he had an obligation to teach. So whatever you learn, you have to teach. It's an obligation. You can't just come and enjoy the show. You come, you have to, learn something. You have to teach it. You have to go back and turn around and teach it. And so there was one guy who was really, really good. He was a really, really good teacher. And he came to the Alter Rebbe and he said, "It's going to my head. The fact that I'm so well accepted and people want to hear from me is going to my head, and ego is not one of those areas that we approve of, right? The idea is that we should walk humbly before all men, right? It says Moses was the humblest of all people, right? So how do you deal with this issue that the more I teach, the more ego I get, and that more I'm not a chassid because of my ego, right? And so he basically was asking permission to not have to teach because it was hurting him. It was because his ego was hurting him. And the Alter Rebbe's response was classic. The Alter Rebbe's response was, "You can stink like an onion, but go teach Chassidus."
All right.
It's not about you.
Move up.
It's not about you. And you have to teach Chassidus, and whatever it is he does to you, and that's your problem. Deal with it. But you have to teach Chassidus.
That didn't sound like a negotiation to me.
Okay, so let's start into the chapter here. So begins that the quote that we begin with is from the Gemara Shabbos, page 156, side Aleph, right? He who is born under the mazel, or the constellation Mars, will be a shedder of blood. So Rav Ashi observed that he can channel that natural aggression, bloodshed, by becoming either a surgeon or a shaychet or a moil, right? I mean, he's going to let him do it in a way that's not only kosher, but that's sanctified, it's holy, right? But the idea here is that any of these personal character traits or emotions or attributes that we have, we may tend to think they're horrific things. We should channel them to good, right? So using that, I want to tell another story, right? So in the book of Shmuel of Samuel, right? So the prophet Samuel is told by God, I want you to go to the house of Yishai, and you will appoint one of his sons as the next king. Saul's already blown it, and now we're going to appoint the next king. So he goes to the house of Yishai, and he tells Yishai, line up your boys, and we're going to anoint the next king of Israel, right? So Yishai lines up his boys, and each one of them is like more beautiful than rest. Tall, handsome, solid. They're great guys, right? And he goes one by one, standing in front of each one of them, and he's more and more impressed. And each one of them, God tells the prophet, no, that's not him. That's not him. And he finishes the line. And it wasn't. So he turns to Yishai and he says, that's not all your sons. Who's missing? And Yishai's response is, David's the runt. You don't want him. And the prophet Shmuel says, bring him in. So he brings in David. When the prophet Shmuel stands in front of David, he shudders in terror because he sees Esav, Jacob's brother Esav. That's who he sees. Short, ruddy complexion, someone who's going to shed blood, right? And so he sees Esav, who was a murderer and a deceiver. And that's who he sees. And God says to the prophet, but you don't know his heart. And that's the distinction. Yes, David will shed blood, but it's in warfare for God's sake. And all of those things that are aggressive that David does, they're all for God's sake. He only does it to serve God. And that same characteristic trait of Esav, who was, I want to say wanton and abandoned, or just, didn't care what other people think, right? Well, David had that too. And when Goliath was out there taunting the armies of God, David didn't care. It didn't make a difference to him. And so that same character trait, which we saw as in Esav, we saw in David. But David chose to do good with it. David did holy things with it. And that's what he's saying here, is that someone may be born with a bloodthirst, so to speak, or a bloody tendency, but he could be a surgeon, he could be a shaykhut, he could be a male, he could do something tremendously good, not just not just control the negative part, that side of him. No, take that and use it for good. And David was the prime example of being able to take those same characteristics that we saw in Esav, but turn around and use those for positive things. So in the 1950s, couple and their young daughter had a yechidus, a private audience with the Rebbe, and of course the daughter wanted to ask about, the nuclear capacity, nuclear war capacity, and she asked the Rebbe, "Is nuclear power, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing?" And the Rebbe's answer, rabbis don't give you a straight answer, right? So the Rebbe's answer was, well, tell me about a kitchen knife. Kitchen knife a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if it's used for preparing food, it's a good thing. But if it's used for murder or something, it's a bad thing. So the Rebbe was saying, so too, it's not about the entity itself, it's what you choose to do with it. And of course, we had that kind of conversation in America Day regarding gun laws, right? Yep. Is the gun an evil thing, or is it the person who's using it? If we spent the amount of money that is required on mental health in America today, we wouldn't have these problems, right? So again, it's not the tool, it's what you do with the tool. And that has always been a fundamental part of the Rebbe's derech, the Rebbe's way of doing things. And again, I'm sure some of you here remember getting your first black and white TV. We were living in Holland when we got that first black and white TV. Came back to the States in '69. We started having color. That was a cool thing, right? But in the religious world, there was this tremendous fear of the garbage and the trash that will end up being on that, right? So whether it was radio or whether it was television or then came internet, there were a lot of Orthodox in the Orthodox world. There was a lot of people who shunned that as evil, as horrible, because it would create terrible things, right? It has that capacity.
Yep.
It has that capacity, but it doesn't have to be that alone. It can be used for good things. I think part of this also is I want to acknowledge the fact that the Rebbe had a degree in engineering, electrical engineering, from Sorbonne University in France, and education. We look at our universities today and we go like, oh wow, that's just sad. What's going on in American universities today, right? But at the same time, a university education doesn't have to lead you down a bad path, right? It doesn't have to. It's very challenging in that environment, and hey, I'm guilty. I went to San Diego State University. It was known as a party school even back then, right? But it doesn't have to be. It can be used towards good things, and so all of these neutral things, the Rebbe said, no, we have to use them for positive things. We have to use them and use them for positive things. Myself, I remember I was living in Sydney, Australia in 1990 to 93. And Hanukkah, the Rebbe said, hey, let's have a rally and let's use the new technology to do a live conference rally with Jewish communities around the world. And so you had, Brooklyn, New York was on, but so was France, so was Jerusalem. They were all over the world. Well, of course, in Sydney, Australia, we were in the middle of summer camp because it's the opposite season, right? We had Hanukkah at summer camp. We had all the boys lit their own menorah, but not by their room because that would be horrifically dangerous. They all lit it in the dining room, and we celebrated together there in the dining room. But when they announced they're going to do a live broadcast, we got all the kids in. We woke up all the kids at bright and early in the morning, really, really early in the morning. And we got everybody in buses, and we drove all the way back to Sydney, and we went to the Great Synagogue in I'm trying to remember the name of the community now. It slipped my mind there, but Bondi Harbor, Bondi Beach area, the Great Synagogue of Bondi. Yeah. So we went to the Great Synagogue in Bondi, and we had this massive Jewish community of Sydney attending this live Hanukkah rally with the Rebbe in Brooklyn and with people all over the world. So the idea was that the technology can bring out great things. We heard Torah from the Rebbe live over video conferencing at that time, and it was marvelous. It was marvelous. It was very inspiring, and it was obviously using these things for a really good cause. Let's look at the next story here, because beauty is not just skin deep, right? So the Torah talks about the idea that beauty in and of itself is not hevel havolim. It's a vanity and nothingness, right? So one would tend to go straight to physical beauty as a distraction. The Rebbe didn't go there. When he had a visitor who was the Miss Israel in the beauty competition, and she came to visit, the Rebbe said that the Torah says beauty is false, but the pasuk continues that a God-fearing woman is to be praised. The commentaries explain that if a woman is God-fearing, she uses her physical beauty for beautiful spiritual endeavors, for good tidings, and please to relay this message onto your friends and the organizers of the beauty contest. In other words, that the beauty itself, along with a beautiful person, only brings out more beauty in the world. But don't get caught up in just the physical beauty. It has to be included with a beautiful interior, a good person on the inside as well. But then, with that in mind, use that. Use all that beauty and things for good stuff, right? There's a story here. There's a few stories here about this concept of prestige, titles, status. It's a big thing in America. It's a big thing in America about, prestige and status, not just America, around the world. But we know it very closely here. And so the question becomes, there were the philanthropists, the Count and Countess Maklov Elkheim, and they were reluctant to use their titles because it seemed so pretentious of them to use those titles, right? The Rebbe's response was, since by divine providence, again, this is God, right? Since by divine providence you have these titles, they are prestigious titles, don't hesitate to use them to open doors for Jewish causes. People will take you more seriously if you introduce yourself as a count and countess. Others may use their titles egotistically, but you should use this unique privilege to positively impact the people you meet. So don't shy away from this. Step into that and use it as a means to use it as a means to open doors and to encourage other peoples, right? There was a Dr. Yaakov Hanukkah. Years ago, there was a program during the 70s. There began a program, actually, I think it began in the 60s, but there was a program that I remember that I went to as a college student. It was called Pegisha im Chabad, a meeting with Chabad. And it was college students from around the country would come to Brooklyn, New York, come to 770, and spend the weekend there. And there will be classes starting from Thursday afternoon, Friday, Saturday, closing up Sunday noontime, and travel day is Sunday afternoon, right? And college students would come from around the country. And one of the organizers of this program was Yaakov Hanukkah. And he had left his doctorate studies to go to take a year off and learn in yeshiva. And he got so involved and so invested in learning Torah that he said to the Rebbe that he wants to stay. He wants to stay in yeshiva. And maybe he'll be able to get his smicha, his rabbinical ordination, and then with that be able to turn around and become a Chabad rabbi someplace on some campus or something. That would be really cool, and that's what he wanted to do. And the Rebbe said you will accomplish much more with a PhD behind your name, because status is important in America. People look at that and it's impressive. And if you have that title, people are going to hear from you. They're going to listen to you better because you've got the title of doctor, or the title of PhD, or that prestige means they're going to listen to you. I remember from Fiddler on the Roof, right? And if you're rich, they think you really know, right?
Yeah.
So the Rebbe acknowledged this idea, and he said, no, go back and finish your PhD. You will have a greater impact on the Jewish world with your PhD. And of course, he came back, got his PhD, but he was one of the organizers of these Pegisha im Chabad. He was always one of the speakers. Here was this professor, this doctorate professor, who's coming with a beard and a yarmulke, and he's talking to all the college students who obviously they're in college. They think education, secular education is a big thing. Hearing from him the importance of taking time off to study Torah and what he had done was very refreshing for them. A very big deal for them. So, Dr. Naftali Lowenthal, also he completed his PhD thesis. His doctorate thesis was the concept of Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, in the teachings of Reb Dov Ber, the Mittler Rebbe. That was his topic, right? And he wanted to publish it as a book to reach a wider audience, because obviously if you got a doctor of philosophy who's now presenting, or a doctor of sciences who's actually presenting an idea on self-sacrifice based on Hasidic teachings, that's a really cool thing. He wanted to reach a wider audience. And he asked the Rebbe about should he print it in Chabad. Chabad has its own publishing house. Should he print it with Kahos, our publishing house? And the Rebbe said, you're a doctorate, you've got a name, take the highest ranking secular publishing house that you can get it, that'll publish it, and go to them, because more people will read it, not only because the doctor behind you, but the publishing house that it's coming from. Use those things, which typically we think of are distractions from the essence, right? That's just titles and status and prestige, that they're not, that's really important. Use it to use that actually to continue spreading more Torah and fulfillment of mitzvahs. Use those things for that purpose, right? Now let's put this in contrast. I'm going to take the same idea in contrast, right? Maimonides, the Rambam, in his Sefer Halachas, in his Yad HaChazaka, he writes down the laws of all the different mitzvahs. And he spells out this mitzvah of tzedakah very, very clearly. He has different levels of tzedakah, right? And the highest form of tzedakah is when the giver does not know whom he gave it to, and the recipient does not know from where he received it from. In other words, there's like a tzedakah organization in the middle. And the reason is because if I know that I did something good for you, I can feel good about that and in a sense, laud that over you. Hey, you remember the time I did you this favor, right? And vice versa. If I know that you did something awesome for me, I have a debt of gratitude I have to repay. And so if the giver doesn't know where it went and the receiver doesn't know where it came from, that stuff is all released. So the tzedakah is even more pure, right? I had a friend in Worcester, Massachusetts, who had an event coming up, and they didn't have the money for that event. And at that moment in time, my wife and I had the capacity to help out. So we did so in a discreet way that they would not know where it came from. We went through a third party. So we knew who was getting it, but they didn't know where it came from. So they had no responsibility of gratitude. They didn't know where it was coming from. We got this beautiful letter through the third party where the person said, "Thank you so very much for your help. This is wonderful, but you don't understand the predicament you've made for me now. I have to be nice to everybody in the synagogue because I don't know who this is from." So yes, when you're a recipient of a good turn, you have that obligation, that feeling of indebtedness that you need to be able to pay back. So if you remove that, so the highest level, Maimonides says the highest level is that level where the giver doesn't know where it went to and the receiver doesn't know where it came from, right?
Long before Maimonides, in ancient Rome, a lawyer, I'm happy to say, named Cicero preached the very same concept.
Nice.
That the truest form of charity was anonymous.
Beautiful. And in
Maybe he was Jewish.
Well, in the temple, in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple, right? There was a chamber in the temple where everyone who came to the temple would walk through this chamber. And as you walk through the chamber, you went in alone. And no one never, and in the chamber, there was a big box of money. And you went in alone, so no one knew, were you putting into the box or were you taking from the box? That's between you and God. Nobody else knows what's happening. But everybody went through that chamber. So again, that idea of the anonymity is a very powerful thing, right? So with that in mind, when someone wants to contribute to a cause and they want to do it in the best way, they would say, hey, I want to be anonymous. I don't want to be known. I want to be anonymous, right? Well, that's great. But on the other hand, the Rebbe said, if your name is associated with that charity, your name is on the building, then other people will be inspired by your act and will say, I want to be like that person. And they'll also start contributing in a bigger way possible as well. And so, again, stink like an onion, but do the mitzvah.
Mhm.
Even though Maimonides says the best way is anonymity, doesn't matter. If there's a way that you can get others to do more mitzvahs, put your name on it, make it loud and proud, because and the Rebbe's example is, in the secular world, you have people that are touting their acts of goodness all the time, right? They're branded, they're publicizing it, and how amazing they are, how good they are, how talented they are, and look at me, right? Which is a horrific thing, right? But at the same time, the Rebbe is saying, hey, if they can do that for negative stuff, for making noise about their egos, we can certainly do it for good things as well, for Torah and mitzvahs. And so the Rebbe encouraged that, yes, publicize your good deeds, publicize your positive qualities. One of the things that I've done with my kids, I think you guys have seen this too, right? I share with my kids something I've done that will give them nachas, that will give them pride in their daddy. Not because I want to brag, because I want them to emulate. So I send out a nachas report to all the people who are supporting the Institute of Jewish Chaplaincy, not because I want to brag on the stuff I'm doing, because I'm only doing it through the support of others, right? But to encourage more activities and more opportunities, and that the people should know that the people that are supporting the Misa, they're supporting the Institute, it's them. They're doing this. I'm just the hand involved in getting it actually completed, but it's only on the supporters, the partners, their support to get it done. That's the only way it actually happens. So that's the goal there, right? So ego. So we all talk about the ego in that sense of ego is not a good thing. It gets us in a lot of trouble, right? But again, someone that Rebbe talked to classically said that he asked the Rebbe, how do I get rid of my ego? My ego is huge. It's like, it's crazy. How do I get rid of my ego? And the Rebbe's response was, why get rid of it? It's a good thing because it keeps you out of trouble. If you stop and think of, if I would do that, what would people say? What would people think? A man of my stature doing such a behavior? God, that's not appropriate, right? So it would force the person to do better, right? So how many of you have had that same thing in service, right? You now represent the United States of America. You represent your entire chain of command. And if you mess up, it's mud on everybody's face. And so now you have to, you swear in, you're taking that oath and that responsibility, which has a lot of pride in service, but that pride in service also means a responsibility to be at your best at all times, because yes, we are being judged, right? You walk around the street with a yarmulke, how much more so a yarmulke and a beard? Every one of us is being judged by everything you do. A friend of mine in Long Beach, California, came to the street corner and there was nobody coming. There was 4 lanes of traffic, but there was nobody in traffic. It was a Saturday afternoon, right? There's no traffic there. No one coming, no one going. So he started crossing the street. As he gets to the other side of the street, a woman there says, what, just because you're religious, you don't think you're obligated to follow our laws? So he realized he had just desecrated God's name in her eyes by being religious and breaking a law, jaywalking, walking against the light, right? So he never did it again. And he told the story to everybody. So we should all be more careful. Because we are. When someone knows we're Jewish, then they're judging the entire Jewish world and God himself on our behaviors. So that self-centeredness, that ego, can be used for a positive cause. It can be used for good things, right? Rabbi Yitzchak Rabin, the prime minister, the late prime minister of Israel, he was in a yachidus, a private audience with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, "How are you?" And he answered him, "I can't complain. Life is good." The Rebbe replied, "It's true what our sages said. Ezehu Gibor, who is a rich man? Ezehu, who's a rich man? One who is satisfied with what he has." But the Rebbe said that's only regarding to material wealth. Regarding spiritual wealth, you should never be satisfied. You should always be wanting more. You should always be craving more. And in fact, the same thing with envy, right? If you see it as someone who's a greater Torah scholar, and that creates some envy within you, great. Use that. Use that to compete. And that's one of the things we talk about is that the competition between our sages. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's not all negative, right? We had in a recent parsha, we were talking about this next concept, which is God said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and behold, they are a stiff-necked people." The Jewish people are a stubborn people. And yes, in the desert, we tested God one time after another time. And not only since in the desert, even since then, we've tested God. The books of the prophets are filled with the people go off the path. The prophets rebuke us. We get back on the path. Then we get off the path. And we go back. Jews are a very stubborn people, right? And yet on the other side, hey, we're still here. We refuse to die. Yeah. We refused as a people, we refuse to disappear, right? So here we still are, right? So that stiff-necked concept is very important. Yes, we refuse to give up our faith in God. We refuse to give up our service to God. And even the most, I love the story, and you've heard this before about the guy is walking out of the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and the news reporter is there with a camera and saying, so you're coming from synagogue on Yom Kippur. It's a high holiday. It's a very holy day, and you went to services. Yeah. So you believe in God? No. Well, wait a minute. You just went to service. Well, yeah, it's Yom Kippur. Jews go to service on Yom Kippur. Are you kidding? That's what you have to do, right? Are you religious? No, I don't believe in God. But yeah, you go to service, and this is that same concept of the stubbornness that I see this so many times. If someone says, "I'm not religious," but they go to services and they come to learn Torah and they do other mitzvahs. "No, I'm not religious." It's but you have a relationship with God and you cannot not do it, right? And so that comes back to that stubbornness, that godly soul that's within us that refuses to shut up, and it antagonizes us to continue to move forward. Even in the guys who want to claim that they're not religious, you know what? You're Jewish. It is what it is. and that's it. We're stubborn people. We refuse to go away. Regardless of what we observe and don't observe, it's just who we are. The Rebbe talks about marirus. Marirus is bitterness. Bitterness can be, it's ugly, it's painful, right? And it was on the anniversary of the Rebbe's father's passing, when Rebbe Levi Yitzchak had passed away, the yahrzeit, which we just had, of. So the Rebbe spoke of the difference between sadness and bitterness, atzvus and marirus. So sadness is a feeling that strips your energy and leaves you feeling depressed, right? And not interested and not engaging, right? Whereas marirus, bitterness, is like a bite or a sting, and it pushes you into action, right? It's one of those things that forces you to do something about it. And so the bitterness of the spirits can be used in a very good way because it forces us into action to do something, right? So by giving ourselves the time and the space to deeply feel our sadness, to deeply feel our losses, we can concentrate the essence into a potent force of growth and inspiration for our lives and in the lives for others. And as I think of this, again, I won't mention names without permission, but I know a person who lost a son to suicide, and obviously very, very painful. And you never get over that. You never get over that. But that bitterness, that sadness, can be used as a very potent form of, I got to do something in his memory, and to help others from doing such a thing, and to change the world to a better place. And so that bitterness creates a powerful energy to do something constructive out of the bitterness. And so that's the concept of turning it to good. It's not easy. It's hard, but is a very powerful energy that bitterness can cause, and that's the marirus, the bitterness, right? So taking, again, pop culture, new technologies, all of those things, and lighting up the godly spark within those things, right? That everyone's talked about. One might think that, how can I possibly accomplish sitting in this little corner of a huge planet of billions of people, and what can I do, right? And yet today we see how one person lighting a candle in his tiny corner can illuminate the entire world. This was from that Hanukkah rally that I was talking about in the early 90s, right? So you had the whole world, Jews all over the world, tuning in to someone lighting up the darkness in their corner, and yet the world knows about it, right? In the Alter Rebbe's time, again, referencing back to the time of Napoleon, but back in that time, the Rebbe talked about the Alter Rebbe, spoke about Mashiach, that when Mashiach comes, you'll read about it in the newspapers. Everyone will know. You'll read about it in the newspapers. Well, newspapers still took time to publish and print and get out, right? Nowadays, with the internet and the technology we have and push serve and everything else, we can know about it immediately. We can know about it anywhere in the world. We can know about it immediately. And so that's the Rebbe's talk again, that this technology can be used for tremendous good. And I think I want to end on that note, which is exactly our class, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here we are from all over the continents,
Mm-hmm.
getting together to learn Torah and to inspire and encourage each other in the performance of more Torah and mitzvahs. And it's all over the globe. And not only that, but then it gets posted on YouTube for other people to be able to see it as well. So even if they're not in the same time that we're doing this, they can still get it as well. And again, that goes back to the technology that's available today to be able to bring light into the world and gladness into the world, and in our case, bringing positivity bias into the world, all over through the use of this tremendous technology.